5 men on rumbling bikes pulled into the gravel lot of the Lakeside Grill just before sunset, engines snarling loud enough to turn heads on the quiet street. They weren't from around here. The way they rode in, lined up, slow, deliberate, told the whole town what they needed to know. Trouble had arrived. Leather jackets with faded patches marked them as the Steel Reapers, a name whispered more than spoken, the kind of men who didn't ask for respect. They took it, and tonight they were hungry, bored, and looking for the wrong kind of fun. Inside, the diner was winding down. A few locals nursed coffee refills, a young mother spoon-fed mashed potatoes to her toddler, and a couple of construction workers compared calluses over burgers. At a corner booth near the window, a woman in her mid-30s stirred her coffee with a steady hand. Denim jacket, dark jeans, boots worn from the road. Her name was Sarah Collins, and while most people saw just another quiet regular, those who looked closely might notice the purple heart pinned subtly on her collar, or the way she always faced the door, never the wall. She didn't wear her past on her sleeve, but it was there in the stillness of her eyes, the kind only earned through fire and survival. The bell above the door chimed, a jingle, harmless enough, but when the Reapers entered, their presence swallowed the room like a wave. Big boots thudded on tile, leather squeaked, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Jax, the biggest of them, scanned the place like a lion among house cats. His eyes landed on the waitress, young, maybe 20, nervous hands clutching a tray, and he smirked. The smallest of the 5 bumped into a table on purpose, knocking over a glass of water that exploded across the floor. "Oops," he said, grinning at the spill. The girl flinched, bent to clean it up, and Jax leaned in a little too close. "You missed a spot, sweetheart." Murmurs rippled across the room. A few people looked down at their plates, willing themselves to stay invisible. The mother with the toddler began quietly gathering her things. She knew better than to wait around to see how this played out. Most did. Most people have been taught, either directly or through experience, that it's safer not to get involved. Safer to look away. But Sarah didn't move. She took another sip of her coffee, then set the cup down gently. Her eyes, cool and deliberate, lifted to meet Jax's in the reflection of the window. One of the bikers bumped into a chair and scowled at an old man seated there, daring him to say something. No one did. Not yet. And then Jax turned toward the woman in the corner booth, the one who hadn't looked away, hadn't flinched. His smirk returned. "Well now," he said, walking slowly in her direction, "what have we got here?" Sarah finally looked up, locking eyes with him directly for the first time. "Just someone trying to enjoy a quiet dinner," she said flatly. "Until now." That stopped him for half a beat. Just long enough for tension to sink its teeth into the silence. The smallest Reaper snorted, amused. Another leaned against the counter like he owned it. The waitress stood frozen beside the coffee machine, wide-eyed. Jax was used to barking and watching people cower. This was new. He took another step toward her, hands loose but ready, a predator circling something it didn't understand. "You know who we are, lady?" Sarah nodded once. 5 men trying to prove they're tough by scaring kids and waitresses. I've seen your kind before. Usually they don't finish strong. The words didn't come with venom. They were measured, steady, which somehow made them hit even harder. He laughed, but it didn't land. Something in her tone. It wasn't bluster. It was a warning. And warnings like that don't come from civilians. By now, every eye in the diner was on them. Some patrons were filming quietly from their booths. Others sat stiff, unsure whether to bolt or watch. The mother and toddler were almost at the door when one of the Reapers stepped in front of her. "Where are you headed?" he said with a sneer. The toddler started crying. The mother froze. That's when Sarah stood. She didn't slam her chair or knock her coffee over. She rose slowly, calmly, and walked toward the biker blocking the family's exit. Her boots tapped a quiet rhythm on the tile. "Step aside," she said evenly. The biker turned, sizing her up. She wasn't tall, not bulky, just balanced, like someone who knew exactly how much force she needed, and no more. He hesitated. Jax growled, stepping forward. "I said—" Sarah cut him off, her voice steady as a steel beam. "I'm not asking, I'm telling. Let them go." The mother rushed out, clutching her child, breath ragged with fear. Sarah turned back to Jax. "You picked the wrong place tonight." He scoffed, flashing a mouthful of bad intentions. "Or maybe you picked the wrong people to stand up to." But as his gang shifted behind him, the weight of the room had already changed. The waitress was no longer frozen. The old man at the table was now filming, and Sarah, hands loose at her sides, never blinked. No one realized it yet, but the fight was over before it even started, because strength wasn't measured by size or scars or how loud you could yell. Tonight it would be measured by who had the courage to stand up and who didn't, and Sarah Collins had been standing her entire life. Jax tilted his head slightly, his jaw tight, a mocking smile twitching at the edge of his mouth. "Marine, huh?" he said, his voice like gravel. "That's supposed to scare me?" Behind him the others shifted, and the air inside the Lakeside Grill turned thick with anticipation. You could almost hear the heartbeat of the diner itself, loud, steady, waiting. Sarah didn't move. Her stance was casual, but anyone with combat experience would have recognized the way her weight shifted ever so slightly onto the balls of her feet, the way her arms hung relaxed, not limp, ready. She didn't need to threaten. Her presence did the work for her. Jax couldn't quite figure her out, and it unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. "Scare you?" she replied. "Number, that would be a waste of time." She let that hang for a moment, not as a challenge, but as a fact. "But if you're smart, it'll make you reconsider whatever stupid ideas forming in that thick head of yours." The youngest biker, the wiry one with a snake tattoo crawling up the side of his neck, took it personally. He muttered something under his breath, stepped forward and reached for her arm like he thought he could control the moment with a quick grab and a cheap intimidation tactic. It was a mistake, a big one. Before his fingers could touch her sleeve, Sarah shifted. One seamless motion, a pivot of her hip, a turn of her wrist, and his momentum was his own undoing. She didn't need to hit him. She guided him, redirected him like a wave catching a poorly anchored boat. In a split second, he slammed shoulder first into the nearest booth, dishes crashing to the floor, cutlery bouncing off the linoleum. The man groaned, slumped halfway over the seat, his hand cradling his ribs in stunned silence. The diner's crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath from every corner. Jax took a step forward, fury replacing swagger. "Big mistake, lady," he growled. As his right hand reached inside his vest, Sarah's eyes locked onto the movement. Her voice, calm and direct, cut through the air like a blade. "Don't!" It wasn't a plea. It was a warning, one last offer to walk away. He didn't take it. With a roar, he lunged at her, swinging wide with a fist clad in brass knuckles. It was fast, but not fast enough. Sarah ducked low, turning her body sideways, letting his fist whistle past her ear. In the same motion, she planted her boot behind his knee and drove her shoulder into his hip, using his own forward momentum to flip him off balance. Jax crashed to the ground with a thud that echoed off the walls, his head narrowly missing the edge of the counter. Chairs skidded backward, and the diner went still. The big man rolled onto his side, dazed, spitting blood from a split lip. For the first time, the look in his eyes wasn't aggression, it was confusion. He wasn't used to losing, especially not to someone who hadn't raised her voice, hadn't puffed out her chest, hadn't done anything but move with intention and absolute control. One of the other Reapers, taller and stockier than the rest, rushed forward now, his boots hammering across the tile. Sarah turned in time to see him coming, her expression unchanged. No panic, no fear, just focus. He aimed a clumsy punch at her midsection, all brute force and no form. Sarah sidestepped effortlessly, grabbed his forearm, twisted, and brought her elbow down hard against his tricep. He let out a sharp cry as his arm buckled and he staggered backward, colliding with the edge of the bar and knocking over a row of sugar dispensers. In the same breath, the fourth biker made his move, swinging a chair in desperation. It was reckless, untrained. the kind of move born from panic rather than skill. Sarah ducked, spun, and drove her knee into his thigh. He crumpled, the chair slipping from his hands. The back of it cracked against the wall, sending splinters flying. One by one they came, and one by one they fell. She didn't say much, she didn't need to. Her movements were deliberate and surgical, decisive but never cruel. She wasn't showing off. She wasn't there to humiliate. She was there to end the threat, protect the people in that diner, and make sure no one else got hurt. By now, even the toughest of the crew, the last man standing, froze. He looked at his friends groaning on the floor, at Jack still trying to sit up, and then back at Sarah, who simply stared at him, waiting to see what choice he'd make. He raised his hands, palms out, and backed away slowly toward the door. "Nope," he muttered. "Not me. I ain't messing with that." And just like that, he was gone. Jax groaned and pulled himself to his knees, spitting again, this time not from blood but bitter realization. He looked up at Sarah, who hadn't broken a sweat, hadn't even raised her voice. "You're gonna regret this," he said, but the words rang hollow now, stripped of power. She took a step closer, crouched just enough to meet his eyes, and spoke low enough that only he could hear. "You picked the wrong woman in the wrong place. What happens next? That's on you." Then she turned, picked up her coffee cup from her table, the one that hadn't spilled despite the chaos, and took a sip. Still warm, still steady, just like her. Jax sat slumped against the counter, blood smeared across his lip, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Around him his crew lay sprawled across booths and linoleum, groaning, stunned, and utterly broken. The only sound in the diner now was the low hum of the ceiling fans and the occasional clink of a coffee cup being nervously set back down. Nobody spoke. Not the waitress, not the old man by the window, not the construction workers who had gone wide-eyed and still. For a moment the world seemed to have paused in collective disbelief, and then, slowly, phones began to lift. Hands that had once trembled with fear were now steady with curiosity. Someone hit record. Another whispered, "Are you getting this?" In the corner, a teenager leaned across her table and whispered to her friend, "She just took out 5 bikers. Alone." Word was already spreading, silently at first, but fast, like wildfire given breath. A woman had stood up, and everything had changed. Sarah didn't seem to notice the shifting atmosphere, or maybe she did, and simply didn't care. She stood near her booth, quietly brushing a crumb off her sleeve, like she had just finished rearranging furniture instead of flooring a gang of grown men. Her breathing was steady, her posture relaxed, but her eyes still alert, still watching. From his place on the floor, Jax lifted his head again. His pride was bruised more than his face, and the realization was settling in like concrete. This wasn't just a bad night. This was humiliation. "This isn't over," he muttered, though even he didn't believe it anymore. His voice, once a roar that had commanded attention, now barely rose above a defeated growl. Sarah looked at him one last time, not with hatred, not with mockery, but with something closer to disappointment. "It is," she said simply, "unless you decide to be more than what you are." She wasn't just walking away from a fight. She was walking away from the weight of it, leaving it behind for someone else to carry, if they were strong enough to do something with it. Outside, flashing lights painted the glass with streaks of red and blue. Police sirens, growing louder by the second, finally pulled into the parking lot. The timing couldn't have been better, or worse, depending on your role in tonight's story. Officer Ray Martinez was the first through the door. Hand on his belt, eyes sweeping the scene, he didn't need long to put it together. A shattered chair, spilled water, overturned silverware, and 5 men with swollen faces and bruised egos scattered across the diner floor. Then he saw Sarah, standing calm and upright, a steady pillar among the wreckage. "You okay?" Martinez asked, eyebrows raised. "Fine," Sarah answered, gesturing toward the groaning men. "They were just leaving." Martinez looked at Jax, who nodded slowly, still dazed. "She's not lying," he grunted. "We're done here." The officers began checking on the bystanders, taking statements, trying to untangle what had just unfolded. Most of them had seen it through their phones, and by the time the situation was under control, at least 3 different video angles were already posted online. It didn't take long. By midnight, the first clip had over 80,000 views. By sunrise, it was trending across every major platform. The captions were short and electrifying. One woman takes down biker gang, protects diner full of families. Marine veteran stops assault, alone. Don't mess with Sarah Collins. But Sarah didn't know any of that yet. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't basking in attention. She was back at her booth, sipping lukewarm coffee, lost in a quiet she had fought to reclaim. Betty, the waitress, approached her slowly. "You want a fresh cup, honey?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, that'd be great." The next morning, everything changed. The phone at the Veterans Outreach Center rang off the hook. Emails flooded the inbox. Messages from reporters, supporters, strangers. Veterans reached out. Women who saw her as a symbol of something bigger. Mothers who wanted to say thank you. Young men who said they'd never seen anything like it and didn't know strength could look like that. Sarah tried to ignore it, to bury herself in her work, but it followed her, on the street, at the grocery store, in the eyes of people who now looked at her with awe instead of casual politeness. Then, one by one, motorcycles began to return to the diner. But not the Reapers. These were different. Clean chrome, thoughtful eyes behind the helmets, patches that didn't scream rebellion but quietly whispered loyalty, service, respect. Local biker clubs, many of them veteran-run, had seen the video and come to say something simple. Thank you. Some just nodded. Some shook her hand. A few asked to sit for a minute, to talk. And through it all, Sarah listened. They told her how they hated what clubs like the Reapers had done to their name. How the good ones were always overshadowed by the reckless few. And how it had taken someone like her, someone with quiet authority and unshakable purpose, to reset the tone. One man, older, with a silver beard and a patch that read, "Road Knights," put it plainly, "You didn't just protect a few people in a diner, you gave the rest of us a reason to ride proud again." By the afternoon, the Lakeside Grill had turned into something else entirely, a meeting ground, a hub. Bikers, families, veterans, and curious locals all poured in, not for the food, though Betty's pie was legendary, but for the feeling, the energy, the story they were now part of. Sarah sat at her usual booth, watching it all unfold like a ripple she hadn't intended to cause. She still didn't fully understand what was happening. She only knew something had shifted, not just in the eyes of the people around her, but in herself. And then, like a final punctuation mark, a figure walked through the door that brought it all full circle. It was Jax, alone, no cut, no swagger, just jeans, a plain t-shirt, and an expression that had been stripped of arrogance. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, awkward and unsure, like a man who had wandered into church by mistake but didn't want to leave. Sarah didn't stand, didn't speak. She just met his eyes and waited. He cleared his throat. "You got a minute?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Always." And the diner's noise softened just enough to let one truth settle in. This wasn't the end of a fight. It was the beginning of something else. Jax slid into the booth across from Sarah like he was walking through a minefield, slow, measured, unsure of where he could place his weight without something blowing up. The last time they'd faced each other, his knuckles were wrapped in brass and his voice was full of threats. Now, both hands sat flat on the table, empty, the tough guy mask crumbling into something almost vulnerable. His eyes, once cold and full of fire, were now searching. Not for dominance, not for control, but for understanding, for permission to be something else, something better. "I don't know where to start," he said after a long pause, voice low like he was trying not to spook the moment. "You just did," Sarah replied, her tone neutral but open. She watched him, studied the way his fingers twitched like they were used to clenching fists, but didn't know what to do when they were still. He looked down at the tabletop where a tiny crack in the laminate split off like a spider web. You ever been so deep into something you couldn't see a way out? Like it just became who you were? He asked. The fights, the rides, the looks we got. It made me feel, I don't know, untouchable, important, like I finally mattered. He exhaled, rubbed his jaw. Then my daughter saw that video, first thing the next morning. She called me, sobbing. Said she didn't recognize me anymore. Said she missed the dad who used to take her to the lake on Sundays, the one who told her to never pick on kids smaller than her. His voice cracked then, just a little, enough for Sarah to hear something real beneath the tough exterior. I sat there holding the phone, and I couldn't say anything to her, Jax continued, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't have an answer. I couldn't defend who I was anymore, and that scared me more than anything. Sarah was quiet for a while. She didn't offer sympathy, she didn't soften the edges of her expression, but something in her gaze gave him the floor, made space for what he was trying to say. I want out, he finally said, of the Reapers, of that life, but not just for me. The guys, too. Some of them are vets, some just lost kids pretending to be soldiers. They're following me because they don't know where else to go. He leaned forward. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm asking for direction. You showed me what real strength looks like, what leadership really means. I want that. For me. For them. Sarah didn't answer right away. She reached into her jacket, pulled out a folded flyer, and slid it across the table. It was for the local Veterans Outreach Center. Show up tomorrow, 900 sharp. Don't bring excuses, bring people who are ready to work. That's the only kind of crew I deal with. Jax picked it up with careful fingers, nodded slowly, and let out something halfway between a sigh and a laugh. Yes, ma'am. The next morning they showed up. Not just Jax, 7 others. Some still wearing the remnants of their cuts, some looking like they'd crawled straight out of last night's fight. But they were there, and they were quiet, observing, waiting to be turned away or put in their place. Instead, Sarah led them into the garage behind the center, where 3 old bikes sat in pieces, rusted, forgotten. You want a second chance? She said, pulling on a pair of gloves. Start with these. Rebuild them, restore them, learn something real, because fixing what's broken is the first lesson in earning redemption. What happened next didn't look like a transformation. It looked like grease-stained hands, busted knuckles, awkward silence that slowly grew into shared jokes and half-smiles. Jax turned out to be a natural mechanic, decisive, focused. The others followed his lead, and Sarah watched from the sidelines, making notes, offering correction, letting them prove whether they were in or just visiting a new excuse. Days passed, then weeks, word spread. Bikers started showing up who weren't looking for trouble, but for tools, for guidance, for work. They weren't fixing bikes anymore, they were fixing themselves. The name came one night after a long day in the garage when one of the youngest of the crew, Tommy, barely 24, who had enlisted but washed out due to a back injury, looked at the half-restored Harley and said, "We're like this thing, ain't we? Busted up, burned down. But we're still here, still got potential." He paused. Like a phoenix. That word stuck. By the end of the month they had a new identity. The Phoenix Riders. No more Reapers. No more cuts with flames and skulls. Just a rising bird stitched onto jackets that smelled of oil and sweat and second chances. They started taking in other vets, young ones, old ones, some who hadn't seen daylight in weeks. They built a routine, mornings in the shop, afternoons volunteering at shelters, evenings helping with youth mentorship. No one was asked to forget their past, only to build something better out of the pieces. Sarah trained them, not just in wrench work or discipline, but in purpose. And Jax, he stopped being Jax after a while, went back to his real name, Robert, said he wanted his daughter to hear it on his lips again, to know who her father really was. The Phoenix Riders started attracting attention, not the kind with flashing lights or raised eyebrows, but respect. Quiet nods from people who once crossed the street to avoid them. Teachers invited them to speak to at-risk teens. Churches asked them to help with food drives. Other clubs, legit ones, came by to offer support, to ask if they could adopt something similar. And every night, Sarah would return to the Lakeside Grill, sit at her booth, drink her coffee, and listen to the hum of voices growing louder with hope, to the sounds of people figuring out who they could be when someone finally gave them a reason to rise. At first, no one truly understood what was happening. It felt like a ripple, something small and local. One woman standing up, one group of broken men finding their way back. But that ripple didn't fade. It grew. News outlets couldn't get enough of it. They came in vans, set up cameras outside the diner, interviewed patrons and waitresses like it was some kind of battleground turned holy ground. They filmed Robert, formerly Jax, teaching teens how to change a tire, holding a wrench like it was a peace offering. They caught glimpses of Sarah moving through the workshop at the Veterans Center, not giving speeches or posing for headlines, just guiding, always guiding. By the third week, local businesses began donating supplies, tires, parts, even whole bikes in disrepair. The mayor showed up for a handshake. Then came a request from a high school guidance counselor. Would the Phoenix Riders be willing to mentor some students who were slipping through the cracks? Kids skipping class, fighting in the halls, headed nowhere fast. Sarah didn't hesitate. Bring them. It wasn't charity. It wasn't pity. It was the same philosophy she'd lived by for years. Purpose over punishment. Discipline without degradation. The kids were nervous at first, walking into a garage full of tattooed men who looked like they belonged in a prison lineup. But that's the thing. These weren't just bikers anymore. They were something new, something solid. They didn't yell. They didn't lecture. They handed over socket wrenches and taught how to listen for the sound a healthy engine makes. They showed these kids how to strip down a bike and build it back up, how something that seemed destroyed could run again if you just knew where to start. The most surprising part? It worked. The kids showed up. Every day. They stopped ditching school. They started asking questions, started staying late just to finish tightening one last bolt. Some of them even asked if they could wear the Phoenix Riders patch one day, not to belong to a gang, but to belong to something that made them feel proud. The shift was undeniable, and the people who'd once crossed the street to avoid the sound of revving engines now waved from porches. They sent their kids down to the garage with plates of cookies and casseroles. One little boy rode his bicycle right up to Robert and asked, "Can you make mine go faster?" He said it like Robert was a superhero, and in a way, he was. But no one was more surprised than Sarah when the phone calls started coming from other towns. First, it was a veterans center 2 counties over, then a small club in Ohio, then one in Arizona. They all said the same thing. We saw what happened there. We want that here. How do we start? And suddenly, Sarah found herself on the edge of something even bigger than she'd imagined. Not just a town transformed, a movement, a model, a story people wanted to replicate. The Veterans Center garage was expanded. More bikes, more people, more stories of struggle being rewritten through the language of gears and gas and community. Sarah created a simple program, Restoration Through Brotherhood. Veterans paired with at-risk youth, motorcycle restoration as a foundation for mentorship. Every bike rebuilt was a symbol of someone refusing to give up on themselves or each other. That's when it happened. The video, the original diner confrontation, hit 10 million views, then 20, then 50. People weren't just watching it anymore, they were acting on it. A woman in Idaho started a community garden with former gang members. A retired Navy officer in Florida opened a bike shop exclusively for veterans in recovery. A group of first responders in Michigan began hosting weekend workshops teaching kids basic mechanics and discipline, calling it their own version of the Phoenix Riders. No one asked for permission. They just saw what was possible and ran with it. One afternoon, Sarah sat in her booth at the diner, sipping her coffee like she always did, when Betty slid into the seat across from her, beaming like a woman who had just heard the juiciest piece of gossip in 3 counties. "You're gonna want to hear this," she said. "A club from out of state just rolled into town, not causing trouble, They're here to learn. Said they want to meet the woman who turned a brawl into a brotherhood. Sarah looked out the window. Parked across the lot were a dozen motorcycles, but these weren't patched with skulls or flames. These had birds, rising phoenixes, embroidered onto the backs. A new chapter, already formed, self-started, carried by word of mouth and reputation alone. She smiled softly and shook her head. "It's not about me," she said. Betty nodded, but then leaned in. "Maybe not, but it started with you, and look at it now." It wasn't long before Sarah was invited to speak at a veterans conference, then a school district, then a national leadership forum. Every time she said the same thing. "I didn't plan this. I just stood up when it mattered. Anyone can do the same." She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She just believed in action over applause. But the world had already decided something else. People wanted this story, not for entertainment, for hope. Because the Phoenix Riders weren't just about motorcycles. They were about second chances, about broken people becoming the ones who fix. And in a world starved for meaning, that was the kind of story that stuck. By the end of the month, Phoenix Riders chapters had opened in 5 states. Veteran suicide rates in those communities began to drop. Youth arrest numbers declined. Police departments even began reaching out to collaborate. One sheriff called the program the most effective gang diversion effort we've seen in decades, all from a diner, a moment, a choice. Sarah watched it all unfold from the same booth where it had begun, never chasing the spotlight, never claiming the credit. She kept fixing things, people, bikes, communities, and quietly handed the tools to others. She always said the same thing to every new recruit: "We don't run from our past. We ride through it, and we help others do the same." And every night, as the lights dimmed over the lakeside grill and the rumble of motorcycles echoed not as a threat, but as a promise, Sarah Collins, former recon Marine, reluctant leader, quiet warrior, knew one thing with absolute certainty. This wasn't a story about a fight. It was about what happened after.